Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to an early morning episode. It's 4 a.m. right now, and in some cultures, 4 a.m. is a very unique time. You know, the poet Rumi has this quote. He says, "Don't go back to sleep. The dawn has secrets to tell you." Let me see the exact quote. The quote from Rumi, the poetic line seems to be fully this: "The breeze at dawn." Oh my God! Hold on. "The breezes at dawn have secrets to tell you. Don't go back to sleep. You must ask for what you really want. Don't go back to sleep. People are going back and forth across the door sill where the two worlds touch. The door is round and open. Don't go back to sleep." The poet Rumi says, "Learn to recognize the false dawn from the true. Distinguish the color of the wine from the color of the cup. Then it may be that patience and time may produce out of the spectrum viewing sight true vision, and you will behold colors other than these mortal hues. You will see pearls instead of stones. Pearls, did I say? Nay, more, you will become a sea, you will become a sun traveling the sky." You know, the title of today's episode is "The Conscious, the Unconscious, and the Totality." And it's a tribute to a quote from Plato, even though I started off reading Rumi quotes. But in the subtitle I've written the three main sources of human behavior. For this episode, I'll be using a notepad. The viewers should look at the screen. And so the journey of the moment begins. Plato has this quote. So pretty much, Plato says human behavior flows from three main sources: desire, emotion, knowledge. At the same time, the title of the episode, I've written the conscious, the unconscious, and the totality. There's a parallel between these ideas. So what I've done is I've conceived here an intersecting point. Imagine the first idea about Plato being one line. The title of the episode, the conscious, the unconscious, and the totality. Excuse me. The implication of this is really the efforts of psychology. What psychology is an attempt to understand how the human mind is happening as the human body. In human psychology, pretty much from the moment the human being wakes up, we can totally see that there's a range and domain of consciousness consciousness. There's an ability to become conscious, or consciousness is like the glow of a candle in a dark room. It encapsulates as far as it can. The unconscious is what is beyond consciousness. The unconscious is another way of saying what exists but we don't know that exists. Consciousness is what exists so that we know that exists. And the totality is the complete relationship of a conscious entity, with an unconscious world, or you can say an unconscious entity with a conscious world, whatever way you like it. Now, when it comes to desire, emotion, knowledge, trio. I guess if I was to pinpoint it, I would say we desire what we're conscious of. That means desires motivate the human behavior based on what it already knows. A person cannot desire what they do not know. Desire is really a sort of just like bingo, like picking a number out of your memories. Desire can be said to be the relationship of a past self with a future that hasn't, or with a future self that hasn't manifested, or with a future that hasn't happened yet. So when I think about consciousness, there's a point of the activity of being conscious. Desires require that. When I think about emotions, or let me say knowledge, I would place knowledge in the point of the unconscious. The reason human beings actually seek knowledge is because they notice the unknown. If there was no unknown variables in this realm, there would technically be no teachers and no need for knowledge, right? This is the hilarious thing, that if we knew what was going on, we wouldn't need to know it. So similarly, the pursuit, the behavior towards going towards knowledge is because mankind realizes that there is the unconscious, there is the unknown, there is that which is inaccessible, and we attempt to make it accessible. So here I would put knowledge as for the unconscious. And when I think about totality, and when I think about human emotions, right, it's like emotions are, the inner response to, let's say, conscious and unconscious variables. What that means is, like, the person knows something, they knows what they are, but they don't know what happened, what will happen, and so the person becomes emotional. Emotions arise from, I would say, a recognition of the circle of the yin-yang. So I would put emotions as sort of totality. Really, even though people say I'm seeking truth, in reality, I don't think it's possible. for a human being to actually care for a truth that could be beyond it. Because what are they caring for? To me, I have this feeling that human beings actually are receiving an emotional shock. And it's another way of saying a creature doesn't know what to do with the emptiness of its world. So as a reaction to it, as an emotional reaction to it, it in some sense creates knowledge. We can say knowledge is the reaction, is a reaction to the unknown, to emptiness specifically. If, according to Plato, human behavior is sourced out of our desires, emotions, and knowledge, it's fascinating because it's based on our knowledge that we have something to desire, and it's based on our desires where there's something to become emotional about. A desire cannot arise unless prior to the desire there's a self in a sort of contextual value system. So it's another way of saying, like, at least this is Mr.Within's view on evolution. First there was the unconscious world, then there's the unconscious self, then there's the conscious self, then there's the conscious world. Right now we are at the conscious self phase. I would say we are in the third phase of outer evolution, outer realm evolution. What I'm trying to point out here is that there was a point in human history where whatever was happening on the earth as a creature, it did not care. You know, it wasn't conscious of its emotions, it wasn't conscious of its desires, it wasn't even conscious of its knowledge. That means, imagine how many creatures on this planet, they have just been sight, they have just been automated sight. You know, I remember seeing this post in a Facebook group or something, I don't know what it was, where it was, but it was this Facebook post, and some guy, you know, this sort of, you know, I think it was as a joke, but it was a, you know, thought-provoking idea where somebody said like you know, a giant percentage of human beings on the planet don't have souls. And it was this idea, just like in a video game, there's NPC characters. There's characters that are just programmed as behaviors in the environment rather than actual, you know, free will agents. Let's say a person plays a non-multiplayer online game, and in some sense they are the character they play has the only soul in the video game. Now imagine somebody plays a multiplayer online game where there's other people from around the world who are characters in that game. It's as if all the extra characters in the video game that are not online players are like soulless beings in the simulation. I'm just saying this to kind of make what I was saying earlier relatable. Something we know incredibly, is that desires are part of our definition of a free will agent, of a conscious agent. And when I say a conscious agent, I'm talking about, I would say, the philosophical implication of the concept of agency. And in another way of speaking about it would be, in some sense, what is moving the moment. To me, the secret to problem solving, the secret to understanding anything is this, right? To understand why, how is something moving. Who was it? It was Nietzsche. I think he said anybody who has a why can bear any how. Anybody who understands the how and why immediately learns whatever they hear. That means if for example, I explain to the listeners, hey guys, why am I sharing these 3 main sources of behavior from Plato? It's because it's it's like how I share it and why I share it. Or how can it be used and why is it important to be used? You see, the mind has created a sort of situation on this earth where human beings can look at physical events, translate them into non-physical events instantaneously, modify the non-physical events, and in some sense use it again. It's another way of saying we're like 8 billion creatures stranded on a galactic island, and this island is not separated by with other islands by water. It is separated by empty space. We are a species stranded in the void. The species has to overcome its fear of the void. It must retaliate to the void by seeing the privilege of what it has access to. It's another way of saying a human being uses its existence and experiences to want to go as far as it can to discover the nature of the continuity of the moment. Really, we don't say this, but existentially, the purpose of life is continuity. Or let me say it this way, I think subconsciously, the fear of death can be so intense that the person actually indirectly has chosen immortality already. I feel that those people who they give into their desires of any kind, whether it's you have a desire to, let's say, eat a lot of apples, or you have a desire to renounce the materialistic simulation of the world to find your pure self. Whatever the desire is, a desire is an outcome of manifestation. A desire is when behind your eyes you have accessed something which you haven't accessed in front of your eyes. Or it could be the other way around. You look at on the planet, who are the most interesting people on the planet. It seems to be like those who have the biggest resources, those who have everything, and those who have nothing. These are like the most interesting people on the planet. You look at, for example, I shouldn't say renunciate, but you see, for example, these old school gurus who would live in ashrams or who would live in forests and whatnot, right, and had disciples, regular human beings who were fascinated at what has this human being accomplished in their inner realms that allows them to be like this in their outer realms. And then it's the same for human beings in the outer. So in some sense, I'm trying to say the archetype of the wise man and the archetype of the powerful man. Okay? And when I say man, I'm talking about the human archetype, guys. You know, of course, there is a biological beauty to being a male and being a female, but at the same time, there's also a transcendental beauty in how the mind that identifies as an entity functions, right? Beauty is a very multidimensional idea, right? Like, you know, I'm pretty sure many people can testify in the outer realms you could see someone beautiful, but they could have very ugly inner realms. And you could see someone who in the outer realms, let's say they're not beautiful and their inner realms are beautiful, for example, right? Or you could see combinations of people who in the inner realms and the outer realms, they're both beautiful. And you can see a person who in the inner realms and outer realms is ugly, right? And when I say ugly, I'm not talking, the way I'm talking about it, you see, their beauty and ugliness, they can be applied to a static view and they can be applied to a dynamic view, you know. So in some sense it is the behavior. So ugliness for mind is how your mind has opened to the world. If somebody opens their eyes in the morning and they hate the world they're in, you're going to have an ugly karma. But if you open your eyes and you love the world, as if, you know, some people feel they have been born in the world, but there are some people, you know, who they believe the world has been born in them. That means they have in some sense opened their eyes and the world has come to see them. They have not come to see the world. This is like, you know, the bodhisattvic presence, you know. It's another poetic way of saying, like, if you were a Buddhist, that those who haven't been enlightened in their previous lives, they are here to see the world, and those who have been enlightened in their previous lives, the world is here to see them. Why? Because they have surpassed the experiential level of an individual's journey into the collective, and now the only thing that remains is a collective being's journey into the individual. This world is designed in such an incredible way that everybody will get to do everything, given an infinite time span. Desires are transcendental activations of reality, actually. They are beyond the world pulls and pushes. So anyways, I'm going to get back to what I was writing. If human behavior is sourced out of our desires, emotions, and knowledge, then we can playfully say that a self can be attributed to each one of these. That means when a human being desires something, that's a different self than how a human being is when they don't have desire. So pretty much, I don't know really what to say here about this. Maybe I could say it this way. That first there has to be knowledge, right? Then there has to be a desire for knowledge, then an experience, event, or karmic occurrence takes place, and then there is emotions. You know, I think it would be mind-blowing if the species realizes knowledge is an emotional thing. Like, if truth equals emotions, that means it's another way of saying truth is an emotional recognition. If we identify truth with our desires, desires usually have shape. You know, I think it's very rare to see a human being that desires the shapeless. I think it's like there's no such thing actually. Like if there is, it's in a way where there's some ways the world activates that is private to the consciousness, and there's some ways the world activates which it is public. For example, these talks, these Mr. Within talks I'm giving, it's as if I've decided to enter a room where my voice, it does not just exist to my own mind. The beautiful thing about life is that we are actually a species in the making of its own future. That means Plato's, let's say trio of human behavior flowing from these sources of desire, emotion, and knowledge. Now that's an individual relationship. We can even say the species has desires. The species has emotions. The species has knowledge. When it comes to knowledge, it's very easy. The purpose of consciousness and knowledge is actually a sort of conqueror's algorithm. It's like saying that the purpose of knowledge is to notice that the unknown is there and you can know more. So it's another way of saying human beings, they behave in accordance to knowledge, which eventually leads them to the unknown. The teachings of knowledge is the unknown, guys. Teachers can't say this in educational systems because if they did, they wouldn't have jobs. There's some teachers who are actually teaching their younger self when they speak, and then there's some teachers who have become selfless to realize the species has to be taught. That's something else. We're reaching a point where we're becoming students of a collective mind. It's like the purpose of knowledge is to go to the unknown. The purpose of our emotions is to recognize the totality. The purpose of our desires is, in some sense, to realize the value of consciousness. We have made life so complex to understand, not realizing that ultimately it's just a creature on a rock. And this creature has a relationship, or let me do it this way. Let me say it this way. This pattern I'm drawing here, what I'm drawing here for those viewers, this is something that was inspired actually in the first book I wrote called The Great Work. And in it I had drawn this geometrical pattern. these points should be connecting. Of self, other, and world. What I'm trying to get to here is pretty much there is, what is it, let's say, 9 potential existential and experiential relationships. When it comes to individual consciousness, we have the relationship of a self with itself, a self with others, and then a self with the world. When it comes to collective consciousness, we have the relationship of others, with an individual self. Like, think of the mob mentality, think of others with others, think of wars or allegiances, and then others with the world, think of air pollution or planting trees, like everybody planting trees, right? These are the dimensions to collective consciousness. These are the dimensions to individual consciousness. Now, there is something I would say, which is, we can term it world consciousness, but when I say world, I'm not talking about a human world, or an inner or outer world, or here, let me say instead of world consciousness, call it totality. When it comes to this would totality consciousness would be another way of saying, like, for example, God, if the world was alive, the world would have a relationship with the individual. For example, God has a relationship with man. You know, God has a relationship with all the creatures in the realm, and then God has a relationship with itself, which is inconceivable to the human being. Or it's another way of saying how a world feels about itself in contrast to how an individual feels about a world. If these three dimensions are cared for, if everybody on the planet, this is the starting point, right? The individual consciousness is the starting point. These are all the levels that the species needs to go through. Right now, we are at the self to self and self with others phase, right? It's as if right now people are trying to efficiently conduct their sense of self, and they are trying to efficiently conduct their self with others, right? But people are not caring about, for example, the efficiency of the conduct of the world where self and other are, right? Like, it's phenomenal to me. People, if you were to prioritize what they care for, it's as if they care for their self, they care for others, but somehow the world is not being cared for. Right? Somehow the species is actually stuck until this level. Right? This level, we don't know what's going on. The self and the world, this is, I would say, something that hasn't happened, but it's the era of the collective being. It's when you're most, it's like when the solitude of the conscious mind accepts the ever-presence of non-conscious. You know, it's like a child being born, and then this child wondering about how many, all the things that it will go on to do, or how many people on the planet will, become the child's friend or become the child's enemy. My idea was that, this strategic militaristic thing, they say divide and conquer, right? In my youth, I was a shy, quiet, passive, honestly naive person. And little did I know that when there comes necessity, the collective mind activates. And so, from the naivety of a sort of inner innocence, the human being suddenly becomes responsible for the world. You see, it's as if, like, you know what it is? This is why the concept of a kingdom is beautiful to me. Because the moment the kingdom is under attack, it doesn't matter if it's the king, the soldiers, the baker, if it's like a carpenter, a blacksmith, all of them, all classes of the kingdom defend the kingdom. Now, what has happened on Earth is that human beings have awakened to themselves on the planet, and in doing so have started having a relationship with the boundaries of perception. Excuse me. What can a temporary being say in an infinitely unknown world? I mean, just keep exploring, guys. Keep wondering about the nature of reality. The purpose of the mind is not to just experience the shape. The purpose of the mind is to discover and create shape. The mind is not just an engine, a biochemical engine. The mind is a biochemical engine for, in some sense, subjective invention. The purpose of atoms has become nouns and verbs, and the purpose of nouns and verbs is to paint a picture which the whole world moves towards. Ladies and gentlemen, whoever you are, whatever being you are actually, when you realize that the game of evolution is actually the game of freedom, and it's the freedom of the invisible and the visible, unless the invisible is accepted, the visible will suffer. Unless the visible is accepted, the invisible will suffer. You know, this is something I know at least of, you know, this the book of Islam, right? The holy book, where in it there's a sentence that says, this book is for those who have faith in the unseen, those who believe in the unseen. And it's another way of saying that for those who acknowledge an invisible potential to how the world is held, not only stories come replacing your eyes, but it's a journey. That's something that they don't tell you about life when you're born in it, but you end up noticing it, right? That it's a journey, and the purpose of a journey is in every moment for there to be an effort to complete the journey. For how long will we feel like incomplete beings in an incomplete world? Mankind is its own completion. The joy and glory and beauty of the human destiny is in its activation. You know, to me, I have had moments when I was younger, where I felt not that, like this relationship of self to self, self with other, self to world. I felt that in some sense the divine had exiled me, had karmically exiled me when I was young. This is something I talk about in my earlier talks, but I haven't spoken about it in a while. When I was young, guys, I felt that the world, I did not deny that there is something moving here. You know, you can see it moving as all of us, or you can see it moving in specific moments, but to me, the moment has always been alive because my mind has been alive. But there's also forces at work. What Carl Jung noticed as Jungian synchronicity, he terms it. This synchronicity is another way of saying the behavior of karma for the individual entity is similar to the biological, let's say, hypothetical envisioning of a biological system to a universal organism. You see, the human body, when there's a wound or a cut or something, you know, what does the body do? It in some sense projects white blood cells. You know, it commands healing, right? Self-sustenance. Now, the white blood cells go, and in some sense, as simplistically as, unfortunately, I can say in this moment, it's like they kick out the bad guys. But the idea is that the human body, when there's, let's say, some sort of virus or something, it heals itself. Some injury or something, it heals itself. Similarly, we can say that the cosmos heals itself. When the cosmos hurts itself, it heals itself. Some of the cruelest acts in history have actually led to the greatest healing, you know. An example would be when, like John F. Kennedy's speech after Martin Luther King's assassination. After a chaotic event, there was a contrast to discover a greater order. You know, whoever you are, whatever happens to you in this life, if you end up being still conscious through it, it expands you. You see, the brilliance of existence is that not only is it just here, but it is changing. Right? Imagine the person's like, wait a minute, you know, imagine like some, you know, a child is born on this world and the child's like, no way, you're telling me there's so many people who haven't been born yet, so many people who have died, and I'm existing in a world right now, right? And then imagine the child's like, oh my God, I'm not just existing in a world, I'm existing in a world that is changing mysteriously. Emphasis on the mysterious part, right? This is why people, I would say scientists are wondering in some sense why people are not being drawn to science as much, right? Why scientists aren't being treated as rock stars. You know, I think scientists feel that. They feel like there's something missing about the, you know, that vision. And let me tell you why. It's because, like, they have denied imagination, and a lot of human beings, they're not born knowing facts. They are born being a mind trying to figure it all out. And what the mind is that there's existence is our direct experiential real connection to the world, do you know? And imagination, it's not that it's unreal, but it is sub-real. I think that's a word that should be connected to imagination. Imagination is sub-real. It has geometry, shape, form, but we can't touch it. It's like a person can visualize like a hoverboard, but you know, it's like they can't jump on it. Or somebody could, in their inner realms, you know, just feel how it would be to let's say, you know, sit in a, classic black Porsche. Right, but in the outer realms, they're like, oh my God, is this one of those foldable chairs I have? No. We have opened our eyes in a world, and we have opened our eyes as an experiential witness that is changing as the world, that is experiencing change as the world. Eventually, what will be realized out of these 9 ways, 9 possibilities to let's say, relationships of existence and experience that I've drawn here. I would say the relationship of self and self, this is where maturity starts. You know, this is where reliance on the will of self arises. When there is self and others, this is the beginning. This is like children, you know, who can't even speak, being taken care of, those who have entered the world really in an advanced civilization. Every child, whether they're an orphan or not, will feel that all the human beings that have entered earlier, because they have the intent of efficient advancement, which renders us as benevolent beings, it's like, do you know what I'm saying? I want the species to not only notice itself, not only to care for itself, but to advance itself. Do you know what I'm saying? This is my greatest realization, that a person could give 10,000 talks, but the whole purpose of the speech is to motivate action. The purpose behind the motivation of the action is to build. The purpose in regards to why we should even build something, why should we care for the advanced civilization? Because we have the intelligence to do so. This is one of the most simplest, materialist arguments. for an advanced civilization. For me, I feel the advanced civilization will be the common denominator, and it will be the idea in the outer realms that will in some sense be like a command to every person's inner mind. Do you know? I may be giving these talks right now, I may be kind of like a microphone for the future generations, but I will tell you, that I am a servant of the future. That means in the future we are not individual beings. We are actually space. But in the past we were oblivious to how there was space moving us along. Really, enlightenment is recognizing the invisible and the visible are generated in the moment where there is an instantaneity of how energy and experience are being the same. You know, a person has a relationship with themselves, right? That means all emotions can be even applied to this model I've drawn for you. Here, I'll call this Mr. Within's nine possible relationships of manifestation. There's even way more than this, but I'm just putting one axis. People think knowledge, guys, is like, you know, something, you know, like a heavy weight to lift, but I'll tell you what it is being able to acknowledge the emptiness, being able to draw a single point. And then as you draw a single point, you put in an axis, then you put another axis, then you put another axis, then you put another axis, and in some sense we pretty much clothe, you know what it is? It's as if from the void there came a sort of lost oneness. And so duality is like we clothe oneness in duality to discover the void beyond the infinite. Knowledge is geometry, which in some sense either has a temporary value or an eternal value. For example, a fact is a geometrical, what it comes down to is a geometrical relationship of perception that is acting eternal. You know, isn't it bizarre that we have the concept of change, and human beings have been born in a changing world, so technically everything is defined by change, but we have the concept of space, and we say that space doesn't change. It's as if you attribute divine will as change, then it's kind of like God. It's as if the divine will is present in the changing world, but if space is an unchanging, precondition to change, it's as if there had to be space for matter to exist. However, if the space doesn't change, the matter changes. Technically, to the matter, the space doesn't exist. You see, it's another way of saying psychologically, experientially, we cannot fathom emptiness and space, but existentially, it has to exist in order for what we are to exist. conscious, the unconscious, the totality. A phase of life is about what we have access to. A phase of life is about realizing what we have access to. A phase of life, the other phase of life, is about realizing what we don't have access to. And in some sense, I would say the final phase of life is realizing how the access and inaccess are both actually accessible but not. It's pretty much, I'm saying, like, this world is designed in a way where it's like the inconceivable can only be true. In a changing world, what are people believing in? It's as if, let's say, you believe in something and they fast forwarded life and you were like, no way, my belief changed before I could believe it. We have to give a permission for the future generations to be able to grow up in civilization without losing what, in some sense, without losing the abilities that they are born with. You know what it's like? It's like, this is what I'm seeing. I'm seeing a species, I'm seeing human beings pop out of nowhere. Just pretty much just like, imagine like, 8 billion dolphins just jumped out of the ocean and they were just flying towards the sky, just floating towards the sky. Imagine 8 billion dolphins from the oceans of the world just began, at night. I can't say at night if it's all the dolphins in the world, but pretty much imagine like all the dolphins just flying into the air from the ocean. Similarly, it's like out of unknown waters, out of unknown non-existence, the bird song of the individual's DNA can be heard. We have entered this world to be alone and together with it. Like, you don't understand. It's how would I say this? Maybe I don't understand, but the way I'm seeing it is that there is no reason for dimensions to be added to a dimension to exist. It's as if God is not following Occam's razor, if there was a God. Reason was post-existence. Existence is more mysterious than we can reason it, than it can be reasonable to us. Reason is another way of saying, a temporary abstraction overlaid on a real event to make the real event bearable. Knowledge is a way a species that is too afraid to get to know its unknown dimensions is occupying it. It's a distraction. Knowledge is, for the yogi, for the mystic, is a distraction. But for the human being who's like, okay, let's say life was a sort of, test of the divine, okay, whatever the divine would be from whatever culture. Let's just say there's the divine and unknown in presence of intelligence in the universe. And then there's the not divine, which is pretty much like, let's say the earth or the room. Okay, now it's kind of like, let me tell you even a better analogy. It's like living in a house, right? Imagine a person has been living in a house. I mean, this is a kind of spooky example, but let me see a better example. Imagine you have been working in this company, right? And there has been an employee working in that company which you have never seen. Or imagine an employee has been working in the company and has never seen the boss. Human beings are found in a sort of samsara-like world and never finding the truth, having not met the truth yet. And now imagine one day, like it's a show of undercover boss. And so this kind of explains prophethood to some degree, that, in some sense, God, the boss of the universe, imagine it comes down to talk to one of the employees, to be an employee itself. This embedded thought, at least I know, is known as the avatar of God. Avatar. It's like a yogi meditating. Or let me see what other metaphor I could use. Pretty much I'm just trying to say, the divine, the greater dimensions come down in the lesser dimensions. The lesser dimensions don't know the greater dimensions are already here. The greater beings are already here. It's as if for the religious person, all they have to do is realize God was in the room before them. And for the secular person, all that they have to realize is that there was a world here before us. And really, what human knowledge is just an attempt. It's an attempt of creatures spinning in the middle of nowhere to understand. Understanding is so pure and innocent, right? Like people don't talk about this maybe as much, but there's a type of teaching that it's not a teaching like the teacher is being paid to teach students. It's a teaching that when the student is ready, the teacher becomes fascinated and gives the student, right? To me, I thought of it this way: is it better to be advanced in a world, or is it better to be in a world that is advanced? And I decided it is better to be in a world that is advanced. It is better to experience collective victory prior to the individual's defeat. It's as if the person looked at time, imagine like a poetic young child just shouting at the sky, being like, how dare you, time, limit my, walk on this earth. But at the same time, what can you do? It's as if you are given the opportunity to be human. Nobody is here a human being. It's an opportunity. It's a privilege of the conscious waking state where there can be any sort of organized monitorable behavior, right? It's as if the person, but imagine a lonely person is like, man, I'm so lonely. Then they find this book and the book says God is watching you, and the person's like, okay, at least I'm not lonely anymore. You see? What I'm trying to say is that the fear of death is the immaturity of a species. When the species relies on its life force, life doesn't know anything other than life. There can be this argument made that life can never, it can experience, let's say, pain and pleasure, but in some sense, life can never experience death. It can't. It's like the yin becoming yang. It's impossible. It's like an additional third dimension that watches two dimensions change, but the third dimension is not the two dimensions. You see, it's like two people can fight and the planet doesn't care, right? Like a volcano, like two people can argue over if a volcano should erupt or not, but imagine if the volcano suddenly erupts, That's the nature of this world. It's designed so that we can't get convinced by this couple-pound flesh of an engine, right? The brain is like a lightning storm in a jar. It's a fascinating instrument, but at the same time it has its limitations. And for the mystics, they realized that the knower within, that there was the whole moment of awareness was knowing itself in a way that a subject-object relationship could never satisfy. You know, it's as if you ask the mystic, are you an object? The mystic would say no. And if you ask the mystic, are you a subject? The mystic would say no. And if you ask the mystic, in some sense, are you this or that, or the mystic would say no, right? Until the person realizes this mystic is answering as if he is standing in a different room. This is really, I would say, what somehow I think I was blessed to get to know in this life, just having this ability to know who knows. It's strange talking about it, but when I look at this world, so many dimensions have been involved to just get this moment to exist right now. That it's like we are alone in a world that we can never be alone in. Too much is happening. You know, failure is a thought that will break. You know, there's something I call, this is a mirroring technique. This is like you can consider it as Mr.Within's philosophical algorithm. But when a person becomes fearless, they give themselves the freedom to move in different ways. Usually fear is immobilizing. Fear leads to like a paralysis, right? Fearlessness means that before you believe, you're still in analysis mode. Because you're in analysis mode, destiny is not confirmed. Projected destiny is not confirmed. A person can live a life as a violent person and at the end of their life realize it was all about peace. You could live your whole life as an artificially peaceful person and at the end of your life become violent, you know. Until a person realizes chaos and order are poetically the younger siblings of the soul. That means greater beings. They don't cherry pick what is right and wrong. They care for the intelligence in the world, right? That means if there was, let's say, a good-natured kid and an evil-natured kid, but they were both geniuses, it's as if like the true teachers of the realm will just realize that in some sense potentials can be activated in both modalities, right? That means if there was a chaotic self and there was an ordered self, and there was a general in a dimension beyond chaos and order, that general would look at the chaotic self and the ordered self and enlist them to their abilities. You see, beyond human life, this is just you can please hear what I'm saying playfully, but I have this sort of view that beyond human life, okay, beyond how this dimension where human beings have freedom and everything's kind of chilled down and slowed down, in greater dimensions, the responsibility of life force is not to be a creation in an unknown creator's eyes, but in some sense is the responsibility of being the soul of the moment. I don't know how to tell you this, but it's as if right now I'm being an individual body in a world. At the same time, we don't realize this, but there are beings that are being the world as we're being an individual body in it. There has been moments where I've had this view on the soul, which was like, you know, very Abrahamic, where it's like one soul, you know, and then it'll get judged, right? But I've also been entertained this notion and this, you know, to some degree panpsychist possibility, and in Shintoism they explain it as if there's a highway of souls moving through man. There has been moments where I have felt that my name and my body cannot belong to anything other than how the whole universal event is happening. And there has been moments where I have felt that, okay, let's say we looked at an object, a body, and we're like, a body is made of cells, like smaller body parts, right? And so at the same time, we look at a mind, and we're like, okay, what is the mind made of? The mind is made of subjective events, and so the mind is made of smaller events, right? The mind is like it's made of smaller minds. The body is made of smaller bodies. The mind is made of smaller minds. And now envision a person wanted to perceive a soul, and they were like, a soul is made of smaller souls. Now, that smaller souls would be the highway of souls zooming in view of Shintoism, and then the zooming out view of it would be, okay, it's an individual soul, right? At the same time, I guess from a theological standpoint, a person can make this claim, like can project this, can suggest this idea that, okay, if God is watching everybody's actions, God is a being that has the awareness of everybody. God is like the mind of the universe that is established a sort of contactable shape-based relationship. It's as if people wonder about, was there revelation, before language? And then you realize it's as if God cared to speak to man as soon as language developed. As soon as language authorized another perspective and dimension to be added to the world, the moment subjects became real to the human being, the human being's attention could be diverged from extracting its meaning just from the present. You see, back in the day, like you can just look at even lesser animals. They don't care about philosophical questions about the world. They don't care about the future. They don't care about having a name. They don't care about identification and all of this, right? It's just the human being's mind that has rendered us with an ability to interact with the world behind our eyes before we interacted in front of it, right? And who we are in the world behind our eyes, who we are in our inner life, is not necessarily who we are in our outer life. Like my understanding is this, that even though I don't know how many people will hear these talks on mine, but I have this view that no one will ever truly hear me in the way I'm saying these ideas, right? And let me tell you why. It's because behind our eyes, we are the decision maker of subjectivity. The decision maker of subjectivity is attributeless. So the only way, like I would say, to a mind's attainment of oneness equals like total unknown. The body's attainment of oneness equals total knowledge. And the species, this is like a modern myth, the myth of total knowledge, right? It's pretty much a legend. Terence McKenna said archaic revival. He used this term, and it's a beautiful, placement of two words beside one another, where in some sense archaic is in some sense the ancient, and revival is modernity. And so it's like, even though new human beings are born, the way these new human beings manifest their behaviors are actually influenced by the past. It's the strange thing that even if we build the future, we'll be like we were using the memories of our past to do it. It's the transition of spacehood into selfhood into worldhood. And the moment the world is conscious of itself, it, like at least from our standpoint, the only thing a conscious world can do is to return to the unconscious. Guys, I am telling you, we are living inside a circle. Reality is taking place, or another way I could say it, just to give more freedom, would be we're living inside a spiral. Manifestation is spiraling. It's brilliant, you know. In front of our eyes, there's this thing about certain spiders where they looked at the spider. When the spider went to hunt for food, it would move in a zigzag way. But when the spider would want to go home at night, it would just go in a straight line. And people wondered why. Why does the spider move in a straight line? And why is the spider moving in a zigzag manner? And who knew in spider psychology, you know, the straight line is the fastest way. Excuse me, to continue. Where I was going with the whole spider thing was that in the outer realms, it's like the straight line approach applies. But for the mind in the inner realms, it's kind of like a zigzag approach. It's so phenomenal when a person realizes how much of human knowledge is dualistic. Like, it's ridiculous. Duality, anybody who understands duality, will understand everything that's going on here. Anybody who understands singularity, oneness, to understand oneness, you will in some sense become the world. It's another way of saying the experience of a self with itself is the ego, right? The experience of self with others is, in some sense, you can say, the species, the collective ego. And in some sense, the experience of a person with the world is, in some sense, there is no ego there, right? You could, like, I know this for a fact, that you can have the most powerful person, like a dictator of a country, act tough, right? Or you can have the toughest person, like, who displays himself as, like, you can have someone who displays himself as the toughest person, but then that person, behind closed doors, they are alone with the world, and their true nature lives in that moment. That means it's like, who knows if cruel dictators cry or not, right? This world is filled with so many different archetypes, and its destiny is dependent on which archetypes we choose to pass on to the future generations. You know, I'm going to go into a Plato quote tunnel, okay, guys? You know, I'm going to give Plato a voice in this episode. Plato says, love is a serious mental disease. Oh, Jesus Christ, is that the first quote? Okay, it's, you know, I think Plato's kind of had a bad relationship maybe in the past. But, the emotional attachment of love can be a mental disease, right? It's very hard to say what love is when every person is existing for the first time ever, right? There's so many ways to view things, and there's so many ways things are being viewed, and the ability of the species is to manage the relationships of the inner realm and outer realm. For me, this concept of the advanced communicator that I've created, I'll get back to the quote now, but this concept of the advanced communicator I've created, to me, the advanced communicator is here to serve the mind of the species. The pilots of consciousness are here to serve the soul of the species, to guide the collective's vision, you know. To pilot the collective. To me, all those people who are famous and popular right now, they have the burden and responsibility to pilot the eyes of all those that are watching them. You know, sometimes, you know, I feel like, you know, I got a vision of this YouTube channel I have right now, one day having maybe like 4.3 million subscribers or something. And then there was a time where I thought, like, at the same time, like, people would say, like, Elon Musk or anybody, right, who's like, you know, it's like people in the I don't know how to say it, but I'm saying it's as if there's a karma that comes with fame. And as someone who's not famous now, I am noticing it. I am noticing the responsibility of guiding or of piloting a species in the void. It's like the coolest at the same time, the most hardest thing a person can do. You know, though one of the people who I would say is successfully piloting a pilot of consciousness in my eyes, for example, is Jordan Peterson, right? Terence McKenna, Alan Watts, you know, true pilots. Because at the end of the day, whatever kind of human being we are, it's honestly just being, that self-judgment is just limited to, are you being honest or dishonest at the moment? If a person has fear in their analysis or in quotations in their thinking, then they are being dishonest, because the honest approach is to confront fear, which is something I am learning all the time, actually, from the beginning of my life. You know, it's as if the creature goes through so many states that eventually it gets bored of its own mind. So then it goes seeking, for mystery in the outer realms, but eventually it will be led to the mystery of the inner realms. It's hilarious. It's like when you live as a mind, life tells you, hey, you have a body, and when you live as a body too much, life is like, hey, you have an unknown mind. Do something about it, kid. Imagine the person was like, God, help me, right? A person prayed, and then imagine a voice of God or the voice of the divine came and said, buddy, I created you, you're all good, just keep going. Or imagine the voice of God came back and said, do it yourself, I made you, it's all good, you can do it. Can you imagine the person was like, I want to see God, and they realized it was like a motivational video playing in the clouds, Of course, I'm being silly. To be honest, there's an experiential reverence to the inconceivable at the same time, an ideological, simulation to it. It's remarkable. Anyways, back to the quote tunnel. Plato says wise men talk because they have something to say. Fools because they have to say something. I think the purpose of speech is when you have seen something, you can say something. When you know something, its confidence it extends out of knowing. Knowing extends out of experiential servant. If a person doesn't have experiential servant, it's like this. It's like if a person hasn't rode a horse before, if they try to talk about riding a horse, it's as if, it's like, why is this person nervous talking about a horse, but if let's say now you were a mystic that had experienced the nature of reality, then it would be so easy for you to talk about it, It's like Lao Tzu says, the truth that can be talked about is not the real truth, that can be written is not the real truth, right? It's not the Tao. The truth that can be spoken is not the real Tao, right? Similarly, it's like, but Lao Tzu wrote that. It's like somebody saying silence is truth. It's as if you said it though. Do you see what I'm saying? There's beyond the dualism and the paradoxical nature of perception, the wings of the bird serve the eyes of the bird. The poet Rumi says chaos and order are like wings for the mind. Right? Just like a bird needs two wings to fly, the mind needs chaos and order to function. Now, the wings are not the bird. The wings are not the eyes of the bird. It's as if chaos and order are just the wings of the airplane. What is piloting here is beyond chaos and order. Why? Because it has the free will to choose either. Simply so. The state of consciousness of a freedom not bound by shape. It's hilarious. We're shaped entities in the void wondering about shapeless beings. And at the same time, the species needs to build an advanced civilization, because why not? Why, to me, if let's say we built an advanced civilization and it lasted only a week or a day, it would still be worth it. Just to see what it would look like. Just to see how advanced life is before we name it. Plato says music is a moral law. It gives soul to the universe, wings to the mind, flight to the imagination, and charm and gaiety to life and to everything. One of the penalties for Plato says one of the penalties for refusing to participate in politics is that you end up being governed by your inferiors. Plato says man, a being in search of meaning. Plato says every heart sings a song, incomplete, until another heart whispers back. Those who wish to sing always find a song. At the touch of a lover, everyone becomes a poet. Plato says there are two things a person should never be angry at. What they can help and what they cannot. Plato says people are like dirt. They can either nourish you and help you grow as a person, or they can stunt your growth and make you wilt and die. I mean, not that level. Probably, there's examples of it in history, but I would say people are also like diamonds in the dirt as much as they're identifying with the inefficiency. It's just a choice. A person can be weak their whole life and in one instant choose to never be weak again. A person can be strong their whole life and in one instant choose to be weak. Do you understand? That's the nature of the mind. It simulates and then solidifies the meaning through how we act in accordance to the elements. Plato says, go find another webpage that has more quotes. Plato says, if you do not take an inch, I read that. Plato says no one is more hated than he who speaks the truth, but the hilarious thing is the truth cannot be spoken. Everything is really poetry, until we realize it reaches the language threshold. What truth is just getting a sense of what was here before you were, really. It's like the truth of the atom is space. The truth of the mind is birth. The truth of the soul is how by being it there is no truth. A true being would not have the concept of truth. An enlightened being would not have the concept of enlightenment. An advanced being would not necessarily have the concept of advancement, When I think about myself, really I don't have too many opinions on it. When I think about the species, I have a lot of opinions. Even of myself, of course, there's moments where I try to break my own subjective stance to see how else I'm standing. But at the end of the day, believe it or not, regardless of the type of desires and knowledge we have, we are left because man is alone and alive. Because man is alive. When he's alone, the solution to that loneliness is an emotional solution. It's kind of hilarious. It's as if regardless of all the physical attainments in life, there's an emotional level that needs to be taken care of. Right? That means an advanced civilization would not just care for the body of human beings, would not just care for the mind of human beings, but it would care for the emotions that human beings are left with in the conduct of their own lives. Right? The idea is what was that thing? I don't know. How do I say it? They say no child left behind. It's as if no consciousness left unactivated. No greatness left untouched. That's it. A slogan in advanced civilization would have on a t-shirt. Plato says reality is created by the mind. We can change our reality by changing our mind. I could totally see Socrates being like, no shit, man. It's like, yeah, Plato's finally learning. Plato says, be kind. Every person you meet is fighting a difficult battle. Plato says, I would say it's fighting a battle we cannot see. Its difficulty is set by them. If a person's inner value system starts off with strength, then like what the hell is weakness? Plato says ignorance is the root cause of all difficulties. Plato says the first and the best victory is to conquer self. Plato says, I am the wisest man alive, for I know one thing, and that is I know nothing. Plato says those who are able to see beyond the shadows and lies of their culture will never be understood, let alone believed by the masses. You know, the issue is that, you know, Plato didn't know how important podcasting would be. Honestly, guys, like we've honestly outgrown like the crucible, you know, witch trial psychology phase of the human being, right? The species needs to outgrow its past convictions of how the future will happen in order to allow the future to be able to bring forth novelty. Plato says the one who learns and doesn't practice is like the one who plows and never plants. Plato says better to complete a small task well than to do much imperfectly. As imperfect as I said imperfectly. You know. Plato said perfect wisdom has 4 parts. Wisdom, the principle of doing things aright. Justice, the principle of doing things equally in public and private. Fortitude, the principle of not fleeing danger, but meeting it. Temperance, the principle of subduing desires and living moderately. This is a great quote, you know. There's all these like incredible quotes lying around in the internet. You know, and people are like, hey man, you know, is this, you know, a social media, you know, post on, you know, the deliciousness of food at a time where we don't know what we are as consciousness? Oh man. It's like, seriously, what can temporary beings do in such a world? Like, the world's too big for us, you know? It's as if the person was like, God, you could have just created one planet to judge human beings on. Why did you create endless human planets, you know? Like, perhaps from a religious perspective, the reason God made planets is for us to go to them. Why else would they be here? You know, it's as if God's like, in religious texts, I don't know how to say the exact way of it, but it's kind of like the vegetables are here for the human beings to use, the animals are here for the human beings to consume, you know. It's like the world has been made for the human being to, in some sense, pass the test of God. But at the same time, the planets have been made as well. So from the religious perspective, an interstellar conclusion is inevitable. It is the will. It's the divine will. It's, you know what it is? It's like there being other planets and galaxies and solar systems is kind of like the universe taunting the human being. Like, hey buddy, you're still trapped on a rock. You can't even get beyond the clouds, you know? It's like the universe is taunting us to go towards it, you know? It's like we're not just a species on Earth. We are a species that have heard the song of galaxies. And it's like the interstellar vision's been activated. And when I say interstellar, that means the sky becomes as much of our home. You know, first the sky becomes our home. First the ground was our home. Then the sky became our home. Then outer space became our home. Then the edge of the universe was the only home we could know, physically. Carl Jung, I'm going to read some quotes from Carl Jung now. Carl Jung says to find out what is truly individual in ourselves, profound reflection is needed, and suddenly we realize how uncommonly difficult the discovery of individuality is. Carl Jung says that which we do not bring to consciousness appears in our lives as fate. Carl Jung says there is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Carl Jung says the dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul, opening into that cosmic night which was Psyche long before there was an ego consciousness, and which will remain Psyche no matter how far our ego consciousness extends. Carl Jung says, an inflated consciousness is always egocentric and conscious of nothing but its own existence. It is incapable of learning from the past, incapable of understanding contemporary events, and incapable of drawing right conclusions about the future. It is hypnotized by itself and therefore cannot be argued with. It inevitably dooms itself to calamities that must strike it down. You know what he's saying? He's pretty much saying ignorance is suffocation. This whole passage by Carl Jung translates into that. Carl Jung says no one can flatter himself that he is immune to the spirit of his own epoch, or even that he possesses a full understanding of it. Irrespective of our conscious convictions, each one of us, without exception, being a particle of the general mass, is somewhere attached to, colored by, or even undermined by the spirit which goes through the mass. Freedom stretches only as far as the limits of our consciousness. Right, what he's saying, what I believe Carl Jung is saying here, he's saying that he's talking about spirit and the spirit of his own epoch. He means like at what phase in history you're born. And whoever you are, it's as if like, unless you're a very profound thinker wondering about beyond time, I wouldn't know how else a person would notice this, but let's say you were wondering about how human beings behave in different time periods, right? It would be as if then you would notice how you're behaving in your time period. And so pretty much the unconscious environment is sculpting us in ways that are unconscious to our conscious mind, right? So we suddenly notice this as being, you can say, the socio-cultural influence in the background of how our minds animate, you know. And Carl Jung says freedom stretches only as far as the limits of our consciousness, right? Because if let's say there's a desert and a person is just looking in front of them, not realizing behind them there's like, you know, the fountain of youth or something. until they turn around. The person will stare at their shadow until they realize the light is right there. So many people are believing life is a simulation right now, but conceptually you cannot believe in an illusion if there isn't a truth, because the illusion is of some truth. You see, illusion is like the blur and truth is like the picture, right? And people are like, we're living in a blur, but it's as if no, there's a picture there, right? The experience of the picture could be simulated. Language could be simulating meaning in ways that are not actually experientially true. You know, there's so many ways we can look at this. Carl Jung says, man is the microcosm of the macrocosm. The God on earth is built on the pattern of the God in nature, but the universal consciousness of the real ego transcends a millionfold the self-consciousness of the personal for the false ego. He says, but the universal consciousness of the real ego, and the ego is spelled with a capital E, transcends a millionfold the self-consciousness of the personal for false ego. Consciousness of the personal for false ego, yeah. It's another way of saying the mysteries of the outer realm surpass the mysteries of the inner realm, because the inner realm's mystery is also to get to the mystery of the outer realms. Carl Jung says, what is not brought to consciousness comes to us as fate. Carl Jung says the unconscious has no time. There is no trouble about time in the unconscious. Part of our psyche is not in time and not in space. They are only an illusion, time and space. And so in a certain part of our psyche, time does not exist at all. Yeah, it's the inner witness. That means what is aware that there is time? Like, who is it that looks at the watch, pretty much? That the one looking at the watch is like time. Like, it's like the one looking, it's like trying to see your own eyes. It's unseen, is the punch I suggest. Like trying to, like it's, yeah. Carl Jung says there's no birth of consciousness without pain. Yeah, but the pain can be subjectively communicated, because human beings can learn from mistakes without repeating it, you know. Or then there would be too many chaotic events. The idea is, if we have faith in the moment, we learn, we accept what is there. If we don't have faith, we don't accept what is there, right? That means pretty much religion is another way of keeping people having a faith in the idea of truth, you know. But at the same time, you know, an idea that doesn't update at the same time is shackled to the past. Carl Jung says it is on the whole probably that we continually dream. It is on the whole probably that we continually dream, but that consciousness makes such a noise that we do not hear it. He's saying that the dream dimension is 24/7 active, like it's like an independent, let's say, quality of, I would say, the Cartesian mind-body dualism, where the mind is has its own core. Carl Jung says the Western, in quotations, God image is a representation of the collective unconscious, an archetype of the psyche that undergoes a continual process of transformation. The God image evolves through its relationship to humanity. Whoever knows God has an effect on him, in quotations. For the individual, knowing God is the process of recognizing and assimilating the pressured and paradoxical contents of the self, which come to consciousness, seek incarnation within the ego. Carl Jung says freedom stretches, I read that. only as far as the limits of our consciousness. Carl Jung says the self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious. It is the center of this totality, just as the ego is the center of consciousness. When he says the self, he's talking about the real nature of the human organism in contrast to the subjective mask it emulates. Carl Jung says in the history of the collective, as in the history of the individual, everything depends on the development of consciousness. Yeah, I mean, if existence doesn't, if existence does not originate, it's as if like there's nothing to say, no secondary conclusion. Carl Jung says that which you do not bring to consciousness comes to you as your fate. That which you do bring to consciousness, whether it was what you thought you wanted or not, is your destiny. Carl Jung says the darkness which clings to every personality is the door into the unconscious and the gateway of dreams, from which those two twilight figures, the shadow and the anima, step into our nightly visions or, remaining invisible, take possession of our ego consciousness. The shadow and the anima, the shadow is what you don't know about yourself. The anima is the opposite of yourself. And when he says possession of our ego consciousness, what he means is that the opposite of how we're defining ourselves can direct our ego, and what we don't know about ourselves can direct our ego. And when in some sense we become conscious of, when we turn the darkness into light, it's another way of saying we are, rather than fearing what we are, understanding what we are, and that leads to ability activation. Carl Jung says the greatest and most important problems of life are all, in a certain sense, insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown. This, in quotations, outgrowing, as I formerly called it on further experience, was seen to consist in a new level of consciousness. Some higher or wider interest arose on the person's horizon, and through this widening of view, the insoluble problem lost its urgency. It was not solved logically in its own terms, but faded out when confronted with a new and stronger life tendency. Carl Jung says, in studying the history of the human mind, one is impressed again and again by the fact that its growth keeps pace with the widening range of consciousness, and that each step forward is an extremely painful and laborious achievement. Depends on the environment. This is what I'm commenting on this. So Carl Jung says, and that each step forward is an extremely painful and laborious achievement. One could almost say that nothing is more hateful to man than to give up the smallest particle of unconsciousness. He has a profound fear of the unknown. Ask anybody who has ever tried to introduce new ideas. Carl Jung says the term, in quotation, self, seems a suitable one for the unconscious substrate whose actual exponent in consciousness is the ego. The ego stands to the self as the moved to the mover, or as object to subject, because the determining factors that radiate outward from the self surround the ego on all sides and are therefore supraordinate to it. The self, like the unconscious, as an a priori existent out of which the ego evolves, it is, so to speak, an unconscious prefiguration of the ego. It is not I who create myself, rather I happen to myself. Okay, let me see how I can just a second, guys, I gotta look something up. So I'm looking up the word supraordinate, and it doesn't exist in the dictionary. Ordinate. Okay. Hold on. Oh, above. So yeah. beyond. Yeah. So it's another way he's saying. Okay, so Carl Jung is saying the self is a suitable way of talking about the unknown self. The ego appears moved. He says the ego stands to self as the move to the mover, or as object to subject, because the determining factors that radiate outward from the self surround the ego on all sides and are therefore superordinate to it. Yeah, he's saying pretty much how your inner realm is held, your inner self animates in the outer realms as an ego, with the knowing that it's like there's something beyond it, right? The self, like the unconscious, is an a priori existence out of which the ego evolves. It is, so to speak, an unconscious prefiguration of the ego. It is not I who create myself. Yeah, he's saying that it's like if we think we are our ego, the self is what is in our unconscious, because if the ego is claiming the throne of consciousness, you know, and it's a priori existent, which is another way of saying an ego. It's like okay, just like matter needs space, the ego needs the self, in the way Carl Jung was using it. And it's coming to a realization that this is one of the most profound sentences. It is not I who create myself, rather I happen to myself. That's it. That's why I'm saying it's like consciousness is like an event that's happening more than a self doing something specifically. That's only to itself, to inside its inner realms. Carl Jung says the only thing that really matters now is whether man can climb up to a higher moral level, to a higher plane of consciousness, in order to be equal to the superhuman powers which the fallen angels have played into his hands. But he can make no progress until he becomes very much better acquainted with his own nature. That means the way to get out of, I would say, a transcendental existential crisis is in some sense to become acquainted with the truth of your own nature. Carl Jung says conflict exists strictly as an opportunity to raise our consciousness. Carl Jung says consciousness succumbs all too easily to unconscious influences, and these are often truer and wiser than our conscious thinking. Carl Jung says the longing for light is the longing for consciousness. Or you can say it's kind of like light enters our eyes to become consciousness, which then is a way of the light noticing itself. It's like processed light that enters the eyes of the human being becomes the visual consciousness to light. It's like you can say the sun is using the human being the rays of the sun are using the human being to see it. Like the sun is seeing itself through human consciousness. Right? You know what human beings are? Human beings are the love letters being exchanged back and forth between the sun and the earth. This might be a strange sentence to say, but maybe somebody should say it in just the archive of human knowledge. That light is the father of perception, the father of mankind's eyes is the light in the world. Like how rare that our biological eyes, like the geometry of creaturehood is too bizarre to me. The fact that there's creatures in the void is the biggest clue of some sort of additional dimension. Either an interdimensional contact happened in our history, in the divergent step of the evolutionary animal. Like something happened, guys, in the past. Something happened that made some part of this universe surpass itself. Some condition was met. The conditions were cleared for the advancement of perception into a multidimensional. Carl Jung says, in sleep, fantasy takes the form of dreams, but in waking life too, we continue to dream beneath the threshold of consciousness, especially when under the influence of repressed or other unconscious complexes. Excuse me. Carl Jung says the seat of faith, however, is not consciousness but spontaneous religious experience, which brings the individual's faith into immediate relation with God. Carl Jung says from the living fountain of instinct flows everything that is creative. Hence, the unconscious is not merely conditioned by history, but is the very source of the creative impulse. It is like nature herself, prodigiously conservative and yet transcending her own historical conditions in her acts of creation. This is one of the greatest quotes I've heard from Carl Jung. This has to be. I'm sharing this in the chat section, guys. Post this on your social media. Carl Jung says man's unconscious contains all the patterns of life and behavior inherited from his ancestors, so that every human child prior to consciousness is possessed of a potential system of adapted psychic function. Here, I'll read two more quotes, 3 quotes. Self-reflection, or what comes to the same thing, the urge to individuation, gathers together what is scattered and multifarious, and exalts it to the original of the one, the primordial man. In this way, our existence as separate beings, our former ego nature, is abolished. The circle of consciousness is widened, and because the paradoxes have been made conscious, the sources of conflict are dried up. Carl Jung says the symbols of the self arise in the depths of the body, and they express its materiality every bit as much as the perceiving consciousness. The symbol is thus a living body. He means it in the ignorance. Carl Jung says the unconscious wants to flow into consciousness in order to reach the light, but at the same time it continually thwarts itself because it would rather remain unconscious. That is to say, God wants to become man, but not quite. Wow. Wow, 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 wow. Oh my God. That last sentence, guys, was so heavy. It's as if God is trying to be a human being, but not completely. Bizarre. Carl Jung is a blessing of this earth, you know. What an incredible vision. I think Carl Jung could be said to be the smartest person that has ever existed in history. One of the smartest people. Like, ridiculous amount of vision. It's as if this guy's inner realms was like a telescope beyond his time, you know. But anyways, one last quote, and Carl Jung says the upheaval of our world and the upheaval of our consciousness are one and the same. You know, more than the world needs outer rebellion, it also needs inner rebellion. Pretty much, guys, I'll end off this episode by saying to the listeners, Plato said, human behavior flows from three sources: desires, emotions, knowledge. We should wonder about the relationship of these dimensions. We should wonder about also simultaneously the relationships of in what states of mind are we conscious, in what states of mind is unconscious being the priority of perception, and in what states of mind, in some sense, the totality holds it all. Pretty much I'm saying that the human being jumps to thinking it's just an object, jumps to thinking it's a subject, eventually realizes the object and subject have a simultaneous nature of manifestation, and so the simultaneity of the object and subject is like the yin-yang circle, being aware of the yin and yang. That's what I'm trying to say. The advanced human being seems to be the being that has made duality conscious, has made the singularity conscious, has made the void conscious, and all that is left is infinity. The last chapter of human history is infinite continuity. And an advanced civilization is part of the destiny of the species. You know, it's like whatever happens, there will be more human beings born, just realizing the significance of the greatness of the future. Advanced civilizations, the idea of advanced civilizations are natural. Pretty much when a species becomes conscious of itself on a planet, when it can communicate and establish collective perspectives together, right? When a species has potential, it is gifted. They say when the student is ready, the master appears. Right now, I would say the species is like a hearing about the advanced civilization because it is ready for the advanced civilization. At least there's a sort of ability to move towards that. An advanced civilization is another way of saying the victory of the world will lead to the victory of others and the victory of self. That means the victory of the world is the simultaneous victory of the self and everything in it. You see, it's pretty much a ultimate win-win strategy to the psyche. And when it comes to our minds, we are 8 billion minds exploring the cosmos. When it comes to our bodies, you know, we're 8 billion bodies, you know, building the world, building the meaning of, in some sense, building the advanced civilization. And what is the soul? But how beyond the acceptance of object, subject, or subject, object, the question remains, the last question for this episode. Have you noticed that what is looking out through your eyes is unknown? And it is the circle. The unknown is the circle to the chaos and order that could be known. You know, it's as if beyond time, primordial freedom is its own glow, has its own glow, you know, is its own roar. You know, the lion wakes up and roars. The soul of the universal sector happened, animated. It has never been the destiny of one man. It has been the destiny of the species. It has never been just the destiny of the species. It has been the destiny of the planet. It has never just been the destiny of the planet. It has been the destiny of the galaxy. It has never been the destiny of the galaxy. It has been the destiny of the universe. It has never been the destiny of the universe. It has been the destiny of the inconceivable. And the inconceivable is its own destination. It's hilarious. It's like the edge of the world is the here and now. Alright guys, thanks for listening. I hope this episode was helpful. Comment below. And wonder about the edge of perception. It's the responsibility of every human being to wonder about the greatness of their species. This should be just inbuilt. This should come innately. This is what I would say is like the true, that separates the true human beings from the artificial human beings. That the truth of the species is important. Just the efficiency of the species is important. You know? It's like, imagine you go to a store, alright, and the store has an open sign, but you pull the door and the door doesn't open. And instead of pushing it, you just, let's say 4.5 billion years, you just pull the door. You never push the door to see if it opens that way, right? And now imagine 8 billion creatures, pushing, evolutionary creatures pushing this door, right? And being like the door's not, pulling the door, being like the door's not opening, and so in some sense they realize they have to push it. Or pushing the door and realizing it's not opening and they have to pull it. The idea is that really ego is just a temporary snapshot of a dynamic entity, and the introduction of greater levels of perception and understanding, which is another way of saying higher states of consciousness, the attainment, the introduction of this, it's like the species is dancing around the fire of novelty, because what else is there in the world? Can you imagine, we were not just on a rock in the middle of nowhere. It was also not changing. Can you imagine? It would be like everything was like an immortal photograph. On some level, I'm very happy there. Like the world changes because it gets to see different angles of its own being. Beyond our culturalism, we will discover a new humanism, and beyond our humanism, we will discover new universalism. Pretty much these episodes are me being like, hey, human species, start acting like universal beings, and then try to see what happens to your karma. Right? That means that if you wanted to be a universal being and we brought the emotional wheel into it, right, it would be as if if you felt the emotion of love, you would love all beings. You see, really, saints and all the holy, kind people, that's what it's been. It's as if Mother Teresa, cared for those, let's say, poverty-stricken children in Calcutta, not because of who those children were, because she had attained a universal archetype, right? It was as if she had experienced a sort of divinity that allowed her to even behave that way. Really, behavior shows you how the human being, what the human being has experienced, right? Nobody can hide their mind, actually. If they act I know that when I'm speaking, the audience is noticing way more than, when I'm giving the talk, I'm just focused on sort of inner vision. I'm just following my, watching my inner realms, but the viewers will notice things that I'm incapable of noticing when I'm giving the talk. It's like a part of me is like, what do we do with all these saints that gave wisdom about how to live? And what do we do with all the future generations? Do you know? And really, this is the game. Like, to be honest, the human psychology is left to play 3 games. You're either playing a game with your past, which I think the religious psyche, the religious mentality moves there. You're either playing a game with the present, the secular mindset goes there, or you're playing a game with the future. And when you play a game with the future, that means the unknown has become more important than the known, right? You become a believer when knowledge is more important than unknown. When like the shape of truth is more important than what truth actually is, right? That's, you know, that's to me what happens when a person thinks that truth is an idea. It's kind of hard to watch, you know. It's idea worship. The species is experiencing mass idea worship because it fears to truly look at the unknown and realize we don't know anything. The species doesn't know anything, guys. It knows what it creates for itself, what it accepts into a law of nature, accepts as a law of nature, right? Like, you know, in front of my eyes, there's gravity. Right behind my eyes, I see objects floating all the time. You know, in my inner realms, I could see any object, like, you know, this bottle of water on the table, I could just imagine it hovering in the air or even spinning, right? In our inner realms, the laws of nature have a freedom. You know what a mind is? A mind is like having a world with no boundaries in it. I shouldn't say no boundaries, but without like the limitations of physical law, right? A person physically can't do a backflip, but in there, like, they can visualize themselves doing a backflip, right? Again, a freedom not in the outer realms, but there it is in the inner realms, right? It's as if, you know, for me, I'm looking in the outer realms and I'm like, why is civilization just rectangles everywhere? Do you know what I'm saying? But in my inner realms, I could see like a work of art becoming like, you know, the architecture of the future. Like, imagine in the future, the government passes this law, no rectangular, no platonic solids can be made into buildings. Every building has to be like a contemporary work of art, you know? I feel like reading a quote from, what's his name? There's this man named Shams Tabrizi. He's evidently the poet Rumi's like mentor. Shams Tabrizi says the chemistry of mind is different from the chemistry of love. The mind is careful, suspicious. He advances little by little. He advises, be careful, protect yourself. Whereas love says, let yourself go. The mind is strong, never falls down, while love hurts itself, falls into ruins. But isn't it in ruins that we mostly find the treasures? A broken heart hides so many treasures. Yep. Without contrast, where is the meaning? Without the idea of immortality, you know, how are we fathoming our mortality? You know, it's like without the absence of time, how are we considering time? You see, reality is remarkable. It's about what's here before we were here and what's here because we're here. And I guess all that is left to say is when you're 8 billion creatures on a rock in the middle of nowhere. Rise, mankind, rise. It's like there's no other option. You know, advance or fade. You know? Advance or fade. Yeah, that's what happens. Either life force activates, or having never activated misses out on what it could have been. Thanks for listening, guys. I hope this episode was helpful. Blessings.